and tell us all about yourself.
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you all for taking the time to meet with me. Just to give you a little bit of more background, I was born in Bangor, raised in Old Town, and father was an Army veteran, labor organizer. My grandparents, like many in Maine, were French and Irish American shoe, textile, and railroad workers. So rather typical of a mill town in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. I was born in 1960. I actually cut my political teeth on picket lines in Bangor and Old Town as a boy. Unsuccessful pickets for the most part, and I've been a lifelong Democrat ever since. My first recollection was Hubert Humphrey in '68. We used to chant for him as I was chanted as like a 7-year-old. So it was a fun bus ride to school, chanting as many Democrats or kids then were Democrats. So Old Town was still a fairly Democratic community, but not as much as it used to be, as many of the mill towns in Maine, unfortunately. I'm running, and I'm running now because I'm, like many of you probably, I'm very concerned about the health of our democracy and environment and the performance of our government. I actually dropped out of college at 19 to work on my first of 3 national presidential campaigns. And I've been engaged in politics and more importantly, quite frankly, in government. I've served at various levels, mostly senior level positions, starting in the state of Maine and working sometime overseas for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in countries in conflict for the most part, countries like Cambodia, Haiti, the Balkan countries, Bosnia, Kosovo, and all of those countries. And I've also worked in a large city. I worked for the mayor of Baltimore following my federal government work, and he was elected governor of Maryland. So I went with him to Annapolis, served as a senior aide to him there as well, and ended up my government sort of career as the acting secretary. Well, I was deputy secretary for a number of years, and then acting secretary for the Maryland's Department of the Environment. So my policy range is quite deep and quite broad. Give you a sense of why I'm running, aside from just concerned about the health, and why I'm running now is that over the years, I've grown more and more concerned about the trajectory of our democracy and the performance or the effectiveness of our government. I've grown very concerned. And of course, what's happened with Trump has only heightened my concerns. As you all, I'm sure, recall, Newt Gingrich shut down Bill Clinton. Mitch McConnell shut down much of what President Obama wanted to do. I mean, we Democrats for over 30 years have been putting forward very popular policy solutions, and all of those solutions, for the most part, have been, hemmed in, if not prevented from even discussion, let alone enactment, by an increasingly uncompromising Republican Congress. And when I say Congress, that includes the Senate. So what I really think we need to do, and that's why I'm really running, we need to advance a range of long overdue legislative and constitutional reforms. And as David said, you can see many of the reforms I outline on my website, costelloforsenate.com. These are not my own ideas. These are ideas that most political scientists and economists have been talking about and advocating for decades, quite frankly, over the trajectory of what I call this trajectory of decline over the last 30 years in terms of governance, particularly the effectiveness of governance, and even our democracy. I really feel it's under threat. My graduate thesis actually was on and this was in 85, 86, was on the decline, quite frankly, of democracy, or the limited nature of democracy in the United States. You can imagine what I think now if I thought it was limited in the 1980s. It's even more under threat today. The kind of proposals, and the reason I've focused so much on these reforms, or a reform agenda, what I call a real reform agenda, is because I really don't think we're going to get the important work done. And when I talk about important work, it's a lot of the work I've been involved in from a governing and a policy perspective for my 25 plus years in government, as it relates to whether it's climate change, gun violence, looking at, making affordable healthcare and housing, sufficient protections for retirees, retirement security. So a whole range of issues that I've been involved in at various levels of government aren't being implemented because of the structures of our government that the Republicans have used to really gum up the works. And that's why, to me, the easy reforms, and you guys know this isn't easy, and the filibuster, and gerrymandering, at least robust, well, and gerrymandering, period. Campaign finance reform. These are some, when I say this is the easy stuff, we haven't done it yet, but we've come close. And we need to do a lot more to get those adjustments, those reforms over the finish line. But I think we need to go even deeper. And that's why I support term limits for the Supreme Court. I support term limits, quite frankly, for legislators as well, although to me, a sensible term limit is 20 to 24 years. If you can't get what's needed done by then, you probably should step aside anyway. So I look at term limits for the federal judges as well as for legislators. Even possibly age retirement requirements. Now, what I would also recommend for those who've really done a good job and want to serve more, if they haven't run for another house, for instance, or they haven't taken on another government position, I suggest we have an independent commission that actually, a truly independent commission that's not encumbered by politics, that's fully resourced, that can evaluate. And this would be a commission larded with experts, but also those who have served and want to continue to serve. They've done a good job. That would constantly or routinely evaluate government budgets, programs, and rank them. Give a hard, evaluation so that the legislators and the president and the public would know which programs are working, or at least they'd have greater confidence in a good, solid evaluation. And to have that take place over time continually, and so that we would have a more, quite frankly, effective government. It's the sort of the old adage, what gets measured gets done. What gets truly evaluated is done better, right? So that would be something I think those who get termed out could conceivably be a part of if they wanted to continue in government. Although, quite frankly, many of them, 24 years is probably going to be enough. So again, I'm focused on this reform agenda, and I really think it's awfully important. And even though the Republicans would say many of the ideas are radical or socialist, they're not. None of the ideas that I'd list or even talk about is especially radical. And quite frankly, they're all Democratic in the sense the little d Democratic. Although, quite frankly, I think the Democratic Party would benefit from many of the reforms. And if they played out to the extent that I think they would eventually, we might even have, more parties engaged in the process. That's why if I look at the House of Representatives, we haven't expanded the number since 1910. Our population is close to tripled since then. We can't have too big a house, but we can certainly have multi-winner districts, for instance, which would allow voices for those who get less than, say, 49% of the vote. I grew up in a district in northern Maine where the Republicans consistently get about 52%, for instance. We were at 49%. We didn't have a voice in Washington. If you've got multi-winner districts that are more proportional, you get more than 15%, you're likely to have a representative in Congress. That's an example of structural change at the House. At the Senate level, which of course to me is the most obscenely undemocratic legislative body in probably the world. I'm exaggerating here, but certainly the United States. Wyoming, 70 times smaller than California, the same leverage, the same political clout. And if you want to look at why we've got a Supreme Court that is made up of the individuals that are made up today, you look at the fact that we haven't abolished the Electoral College and gone to direct popular vote with ranked choice voting when you have more than two candidates. And we haven't made adjustments to the Senate that give greater weight to the population of a state than simply what was done in 1787. So my last big reform I'll mention is that the Constitution, of course, is sacred. But the Constitution, many conservative men, the 55 of them back in 1787, thought would improve upon their work over time. Well, there have been 11,000 amendments proposed, only 27 has succeeded. So what I would suggest is we've got to make it easier, not too easy to amend the Constitution, but an example, an idea would be that we go to about 60% approval of both houses of Congress. Right now, it requires 2/3. But more importantly, instead of requiring 3/4 of state approval, because as you know, that's the real hurdle, that we could go with a 60% population number. So for instance, states representing 60% or more of the United States population would be the threshold. So again, it would still be hard to amend the Constitution, but again, it wouldn't be as hard or near impossible as it is today. And I'm going to start there with reforms. If you've got questions, I'd love to get into it, but I don't want to get too crazy in the weeds. I would say this, and I know David heard this at the convention. I clearly understand, I'm well aware of my underdog status in this contest. And that's why I'm saying to Democrats, if you really want change, consider me. We've got ranked choice voting, so I'm not worried about being a spoiler. I would never want to be a spoiler. We've got ranked choice voting, so I would encourage Democrats, vote for a restless, full-throated Democrat for number one, and then one of the independents. And of course, I think the big independent in the race, of course, is Angus King. Vote for Angus number two. What I would say, because I appreciate, I don't know him, even though we live in the same town. As I said, I grew up in, Old Town, so I haven't spent as much time in Brunswick as he has. But I would say this about the reason that I'm running and against him, because of course I am running against him, is that I appreciate the fact that he's caucused with Democrats. He's been a safe bet, and he continues to be a safe bet. And Maine, quite frankly, is a safe bet for Democrats. Either way, we play this out. So that's the good news. But my concern is he's a backbencher. He doesn't have the level of influence that I think a solid Democrat in the caucus would. For instance, and also he's, from my perspective, he's been reticent to support the kind of reforms I'm talking about. I really don't think we're going to get much important work done. And I think recent history shows this to be true, unless we really start to take a hard look at the reforming our practices and institutions, the kind of things that I lay out and have talked about briefly here. And that's why I'm running. And I just don't think Senator King in his last term is going to be any less cautious than he's been in his first two terms. So that's all I would say about that. The one thing I would say about independents as well is, because there are a couple of in the race now, is that from my perspective, independent candidates have, for the most part, undermined the Democratic Party and have not helped it prosper and grow. And that's why I think, and that's why I'm a much, the bottom line is in Washington, parties rule. And to the extent that people have run against a party because it's easy to say I'm an independent and I'm not part of the mess, I'm not part of, and let's face it, one of the big false narratives in Washington is that Democrats are equally responsible for the failures. And that's not true. We've been willing to compromise on almost every policy solution. And most of the solutions we've come up with are broadly popular. We're not getting them through because of how Congress is structured, and it's only benefiting those in power, and it's not benefiting the many. And let me just, you probably all exhaust. I'll stop there, and I'd love to answer any questions or throw a few more things out if you've got the time. But thank you for being patient and taking it in. Yeah.
Thank you, David. Anyone have some questions for David? Mary. You're muted, Mary.
Yeah.
Mary, you're muted.
Yeah.
Muted.
Thank you. I do that all the time. David, I was just wondering, are there any particular members of Congress right now that you think you would find common cause with?
Well, I think, and again, I think if you look at my reform proposal, well, there are a number of senators. I think there are a lot of senators in particular, Democratic senators, who very much would support these kind of reforms. I think almost anyone I would talk to who's a Democrat they'd be hard pressed to say they're opposed to any one of these reforms. Now, many would think they're awfully hard to get through. But of course, as you probably all know, banning gerrymandering, the filibuster, Senate holds, campaign finance reform, voter suppression, anti-voter suppression laws like the Voting Rights Act, those kinds of things had a lot of Democratic support, and we only lost by a couple of votes, quite frankly, during President Biden's first term, right? So I think most of the Democratic senators I'd find common cause with, and many wouldn't think I'm that particularly radical. Again, they would say, this is awfully hard. It's going to be hard to do. But I'd say to them, if we don't do this, then look where we are. Look what we're stuck with. And it's not working. What's happening in Washington right now isn't working. We've got to go the extra mile. We've got to mobilize a lot more support. And one thing I would say about the public, which to me isn't heartening, is that all the credible surveys, like the Pew surveys, close to 80% of Americans want meaningful political change. Now, of course, some people are a little far out there on some of the changes, but there's a lot of public support if we can get politicians to mobilize and organizations to mobilize in a credible way to work this out.
Ivy?
Hi there. We have a washing machine rattling in the background. Sorry about that. David, thank you so much for coming to meet with us in Knox County. Really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed hearing what I heard of your remarks. I had a controversial question, which I probably shouldn't ask. And then I have one question, which I will ask, which is, Susan Collins, of course, is going to be our other senator and a Republican, who, most of us respect quite a bit. But how do you see your ability to work with Susan? Do you have any relationship with her? Do you foresee any pluses, minuses to working alongside with her?
Well, I've met her. I actually met her when I worked for the mayor of Baltimore. I actually went to I brought her in because the mayor then was the chair of the mayor's Homeland Security Committee. She was on government oversight. So he knew I was from Maine. He said, well, why don't you go pick her up, basically? So I got to take her around Baltimore, show her a lot of the projects that were underway, some of the challenges in the city. So I found her to be very pleasant. She's from Caribou, I'm from Old Town. So that was an easy kind of, although she knows I'm a very partisan Democrat. And she knew the mayor was a very partisan Democrat. So very polite. I mean, all I would say is this: I certainly disagree with her, on many issues, many issues. And I don't like the way she's been so supportive of Mitch McConnell and what they've done in the Senate particularly against President Obama, which I think would, so I think the good news is I could easily work with her because I do think she's someone you can easily talk to. But unless the Congress changes, and I think she would change with the Congress. I mean, quite frankly, I think she'd be more moderate and hopefully, well, she may not run again, right, in 2 years, or she may not be elected in 2 years. But if she were there, I think she's certainly the kind of Republican I could easily work with. And I think most, again, I think if you look at the Senate, it's not so much the characters, although there are a lot of, I would say more on the right, some bad dudes mostly, right, that are so hard right, they don't want to work at all with Democrats. But I think certainly the Democrats are going to be easy folks to work with any moderate Republicans. And there aren't many left. I mean, you've got Murkowski and mostly Collins, right? So it's a tough place, but the Democrats are the better folks there, the more reasonable folks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, I have a question, David. It seems to me that Democrats more recently have been running more from fear than, even though we have a strong platform. I worked on the Maine State Platform Committee. I felt we came up with a very good platform. But the platform is a lot of wishes and preferences and values. But then when it comes to doing the hard knocks fighting for something, it seems that we're always afraid that we have to go in with somebody who will appeal to everybody and not really put our best foot forward. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's why one of the things, if you get a chance, check out my and I can't stand Elon Musk, but I'm trying to do these tweets or X posts or whatever they're called now. And one talks about, I really do think that we have, and this is not just Maine, but in so many places, people who don't rock the boat, people who come across as the most centrist in the eyes of, quite frankly, media, are the ones who are the most electable, but don't often deliver many benefits. And that's what I'm trying to say, is that we've got to focus more on the policy benefits. And as you said, the values embedded in the platform. And I would say this, David, one thing about, the middle, because people say, well, I'm putting my finger up, or politicians, where's the middle? I want to be in the middle of many, right? And I know Angus King does this. I mean, he's kind of saying, where's the middle of the Senate? Well, I'll take the middle of the Senate back in 1975 or 1978. I won't take the middle now because it's blown way off to the right, right? But to me, the middle, and the most important thing to get candidates to focus on, what's the moral middle? What's the pragmatic, practical, government effectiveness middle in terms of the policies that you would support? And again, so David, I'm agreeing with you, but at the same time, it is a challenge to get politicians to stop worrying about the polls and about where the middle is, and to focus on, again, the moral middle and the pragmatic policy solution middle. And I think we can do that, again, is if we sort of row together and say, well, wait a minute, this is what we really need to get done if we want to address, if we want Medicare for all, right? Or at least for all who want it. Or if we really want to protect Social Security, if we want to balance the budget by raising taxes, or at least eliminating the Bush and the Trump tax cuts, right? So that we can actually have the revenue to take care of Social Security, ensure affordable housing and healthcare, all of that. And those are the kinds of things I think we can win over the public if, again, we stay the course and focus on, again, these practical, solutions. And as you know, they're all embedded in the platform. I mean, many of the things that Democrats have been pushing in the Senate, at least most Democrats, are embedded in state party platforms.
David, are you speaking at venues that involve more younger Mainers?
Well, I'm trying to.
College students and 20-year-olds and early 30-year-olds.
I have a bit, although I want to do it more, and I'm trying to reach out. I mean, obviously, as you all know, I've got a real challenge to try to just become known. And I would love to talk to young people, because I do. The few that I have talked to, like the UMaine Democrats or the Bates Democrats, they do seem to like what I'm saying in terms of reform, because, again, it's their future. I mean, we could end gerrymandering now to restructure the House and the Senate the way I think we need to. That's a longer term project. And that's why I say this is on you. It's important for us to start now, but you can see how it would benefit your future, and how much better our government would be in terms of being more democratic, accountable, responsive, and effective. And it resonates, but I haven't been able to speak to enough. I mean, it's really a challenge for me just to get out to meet as many people as I can, and to talk to as many people as I can, like you folks. And so I hear what you're saying, David, and it's definitely strategy. And I've got a couple of young people working on it, just trying to reach out to any sort of young people organizations, whether that's the Youth for Climate Justice.
Are you getting help from the Maine Democratic Party?
Well, I think you guys know the Democratic Party is in a bit of an uncomfortable position. And it's because, Angus does have a lot of establishment support. So I've been reaching out to Democrats, and I'm finding support in various places. But at the same time, I'm getting a bit of a cold shoulder, to be honest, in other places. So it's a bit of a challenge, and that's why I think if I can talk to Democrats and really say, well, I am a real Democrat. I know Angus, used to be a Democrat, and he's a safe bet. I don't want to take much away from him. I'm just trying to say I can do more for the party, but more importantly, I think I can do more, or people like me working in Congress can do more for the country than sort of being overly cautious because of the politics of, the political realities of the day. And as you know, politics, again, it does go like this, right? The wind changes. And I mean, we've got to just focus on quite frankly, the right kinds of policies and programs and be, persistent.
I'm a very strong advocate of the ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
Very disappointed that we don't have it for every election, including the governor. So I'd like to see the state of Maine really accomplish that, so that presently it confuses some of the voters because they're not sure whether they're ranked choice voting or not ranked choice voting on some of the decisions or election decisions they make. But I think it's extremely important for you to point out that, as you did, about how the ranked choice voting would not necessarily turn the election over to a Republican.
Right. Yeah, no, I try to, you're right, David. And I try to say that almost at every opportunity, particularly to speak to Democrats, because it isn't about losing the seat. I really think that the Democratic, or the sort of the center left, if you describe it that way, we'd probably get about 70% of the vote. And I don't see the Republican candidate. She has no governing experience. She's sort of these, MAGA. She's justified many of the MAGA sort of conspiracy kinds of things. So even though I think she's a pleasant person, I've met her, I don't see her as getting a lot of votes, or that many votes, maybe 25%. So that's why I think that on the Democratic or the Democratic leaning side, I think we're apt to get close to 70% of the vote if things go right. But I don't see the Republican being much of a threat overall. And with this other independent in the race, it's he's likely to cut in as well in a way that would bode well for at least what I describe as the sort of the Democratic or the center left kind of vote. Any questions on Gaza or?
Well, I if you don't mind,
Yeah.
I read your statement on Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of personal reading on it, and I've been reading historical accounts by Israeli writers, and I think we all as Americans have the misunderstanding that all Jews are alike, and that all Jewish people have the same attitude about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. And that's not true. I'm finding that there are a number of historians that have come out with good documentation from Israeli archives explaining that what we are seeing today in Gaza has really been around in some form since 1947. Mm-hmm. And if anyone wants to read a good book or a good historian, Elon Pappe, Pappe, has written a number of books on this, and so until we understand what the Palestinians have been going through, and what's been going on in Israel, the intent of setting up a state, I don't have a problem with, although it has implications. Just like when Europeans came over to our country and decided that there was nobody living here, and we could just take all the land and build all our houses and do whatever we want. And then, by the way, the Indians are killing us, so we have to do something about it.
Yeah, exactly.
We kind of lost David, huh?
Oh, too bad.
Who's speaking?
He's frozen.
Do you
Yeah,
think of the
hopefully
Gaza
he'll be back
situation?
shortly. We were a little worried. I don't know if you're experiencing down, David, all the thunder shower activity.
We're getting one right now. Although it's, we welcome the rain as long as it's not too extreme. I think David might be back, but just a couple of things in terms of the experience that I have, which I think when I talk about the breadth, I have worked in countries in conflict, as I said, Cambodia, Haiti, Kosovo, Bosnia, and I've been to Israel and Egypt. So I do think I've got a pretty good grounding in terms of actually having been on the ground and trying to work to reinforce peace. It's awfully difficult. And one thing I would say about the problems in Israel and Palestine now is we were so close with Oslo, the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s. And it's so unfortunate that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli because there had been real movement at that time for a credible two-state solution. And it's so hard to see the way forward, given that right-wing politics has been so embedded in Israel since then. And of course, Hamas became embedded as a quite frankly, a right-wing entity, terrorist entity ultimately in Gaza. So it's really unfortunate. One thing I would add too on climate, as I look at the heavy rain outside, is I've done a lot of, and this is one of the things that David, if you can hear me, has appealed to younger people, is I've done a lot of work on climate. For those of you who may know NRCM here, I did some work for them as Maine was coming up with its climate plan. In Maryland, I oversaw the development of a climate action plan there in in 2008 through 2015 or so. And I chaired the state's commission on climate. So that's something has been a real focus of mine: climate, clean energy, those kinds of things. But I'll stop filibustering because I want to
So
stop.
David, you brought up Israel and Gaza, and by the way, Laura and I are from Maryland, so we're glad to hear you lived in Maryland and Maine. So you mentioned Israel and Gaza. What is your feeling about our support? So strong support of Israel at this point.
Well, I actually, you probably know Senator Van Hollen, or maybe you've heard the name. He and Senator Sanders were 2 of 8 senators who first proposed the suspension of offensive weapons, and I supported that. That was back a number of months ago now. I think again, I think as everybody was horrified by what happened on October 7th, and Israel had an obligation, not only a right but an obligation to respond. But unfortunately, I thought the response almost immediately was excessive. The 1,000-pound bombs on neighborhoods where people know there are thousands, hundreds of civilians and innocents is indefensible. Now, so having said that, I think you'll see the Biden administration's approach had evolved. I mean, continued growing frustration with Netanyahu. And of course, the Qataris in Egypt growing frustration, and the Saudis with Hamas. I mean, as I think you probably know, Hamas doesn't have a lot of support among a lot of Arab nations because they've been troublemakers for them as well. So it's an extremely complicated, I think, and David mentioned this, there are a lot of good books. And I know some don't like Thomas Friedman, but I think Thomas Friedman's done a pretty good job of trying to explain the history as a journalist, although he's an author as well, as you probably know, and even looking at solutions. And I do think that the Israeli government has to change. because I don't think they're interested, quite frankly, in the kind of solutions that are going to work. And of course, Hamas must not be the representative of the Palestinian people. So it's very complicated, but I do hope that what's going on now, in some ways, a catalyst finally to get to a credible two-state solution, because otherwise there's likely to be no solution in that part of the world. Yeah.
Can I
Okay.
ask a question,
Yes.
David? We're between a rock and a hard place with this Biden issue now, and his health and his age, and all of the media coming out telling him he should step aside, et cetera, et cetera. What is your opinion of all of that?
That's a tough one. I think, and I mean, I'm worried, to be honest. I'm very worried. I think they've done a good job of tamping down Democrats who wanted him to step aside. And I mean, I obviously, I think, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, think Joe Biden's done a wonderful job. He, quite frankly, his administration has done more in getting things done. Now, I don't think the infrastructure, we got it done, and he deserves credit for it. But of course, it's 20 years late. So I'm giving him credit for things that we couldn't do under Obama and Clinton, quite frankly, because of an intransigent Republican Party, right? And the CHIPS bill, as it brings back manufacturing, particularly with critical technology. And, you know, obviously he wants to protect Roe or codify Roe and protect reproductive freedom. So he's been a great president. But I would be dishonest if I didn't say I'm worried about where he is and where the voters are. And the voters I hear from are concerned. But I will, as a Democrat, I've supported every Democrat running for president since Jimmy Carter. And I even worked against him in the primary, but worked for him in the fall, because my first presidential campaign was to leave school to work for Ted Kennedy back in 1980. But I then worked for Jimmy Carter. I will support him. I think all of us realize what a danger Donald Trump is. So if he continues to be the nominee, which looks as though he will be, unless, again, he's the only one who will make a decision about whether or not he can step aside. I will support the Democratic nominee and hope for the best, because boy, it's going to be a mess if Trump wins.
Well, David, this is Laura here. I think that one of your initiatives or things that you're trying to get to happen, he's actually helping, which is to have term limits or age limits.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'm very frustrated with people who are beyond the age. I don't know what the age should be, but it's so much about ego and not about what the people need. And if Joe Biden could have been mentoring and grooming the next generation, you know, what a legacy. If Ruth Bader Ginsburg had mentored and helped other people come along, oh, then we wouldn't have to like say their name and cringe at the same time, even though their life's work is huge. But I mean, I have been worried about term limits and age limits in the past, but I think I'm on your side now. I think that we have to do something different. So
Yeah, and the term limits, because I actually worked for the Secretary of State back when Maine passed term limits, and we were opposed to term limits because they're not particularly democratic, right? But that's why I think I've changed over time. And that's why I think you got to give people enough time. It can't just be 8 years. It should be 20 to 24 years. And I think that's enough time to really make a difference. And then if you have the off-ramp that I suggest, those who want to continue to serve, as you know, if you're in the House, you can run for the Senate, and in the Senate, you could run for the House, or you could be part of this commission, right, that evaluates frankly and honestly evaluates government services, programs, and budgets without worrying about the political, fallout of your rankings or your decisions. So that's why I support. Now, I suggest 80 years as the cutoff, as a retirement age. Now, know that the military has a cutoff age that's much younger. Even the cardinals who vote for popes is 75. So I do think at some point we could at least consider that.
Yeah.
But and of course you can, as life expectancy, which I think it will as we continue to improve our health, you can always raise it. If you started at 80, you could raise it to 85 in 20 years. Who knows, right?
I think it's part of what's making it hard for young people to want to get involved is how can you, if you're a young, haven't done anything or haven't done much, and here's somebody with all the clout and you don't stand a chance. So anyway, you were going to say something?
I was just gonna say, about your independent committee or council, just to keep in mind the CFPB and its its struggles politically survive, and an independent body making policy, if you will, by saying certain things are more valid and I don't know.
What is it? What's the CFA?
Consumer Financial Protection
Oh.
Board.
Yeah, that's
Bureau.
Elizabeth Warren's.
And-
Yeah.
And,
Well, that's an agency.
Anyway, it's
that's
just
well, the difference though, that agency is encumbered by Congress because its budget's controlled. And that's why I'm saying this would truly have to be independent and have to have an independent source of funding. So it would really be, we did something in Maryland where we called State Stat, where we tried to evaluate the health of the Bay, for instance. Chesapeake Bay in Maryland's a big deal from an environmental standpoint. And we tried to stat and have metrics to say what were all the nutrients, where were they coming from, the pollution, and how do we mitigate it, all of that. But of course, it was tied to the governor, so the governor didn't like bad grades, even though he designed he wants the program. You got to take politics out of it. And that's one thing I would say. Even in Britain, we modeled after what Prime Minister Blair had done. And we had what were called, they had stock takes, taking stock. But again, you don't take real stock unless you take the politicians out of the grading and the ranking and the evaluation. And that's why that kind of entity would really, truly have to be independent and independent of politics, and more so than the Supreme Court, and make sure it's larded with true experts that are chosen from fields of economics, medicine, and not just politicians choosing who's a part of that entity. Yeah.
Mike, you're muted if you want to talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I don't I don't mean to be rude, but I've got to jump off to another Zoom meeting at 7. But David, I wanted to ask you a question, eh? And I saw you up in Brooks and at the convention, and I got to tell you, anytime anybody uses the word policy and governance in the same sentence, I get a big thrill, big smile. But I love to hear that stuff. But nevertheless, as you know, people don't really vote on policy. They vote on emotional connections, more or less. Eh? And so I was curious, what in your current campaign, what kind of connections, I guess, are you trying to make as you campaign? I asked this as a campaigner, so I'm always interested in that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to, I think what helps is the fact that, I grew up in a working class family. So I'm trying to connect with folks who I think have started to leave the party, quite frankly, and to really focus on not just my upbringing, but the understanding that, instead of focusing on guns, right? How do you feel about your retirement security? What about the cost of transportation, gasoline? What about your housing and your health care? Don't you think Democrats are going to do better for you in that regard? So I'm trying to, from a purely political standpoint, I'm just trying to connect better, and I think I can, given where I come from and my background. But I do, as far as the other stuff, just retail. I'm willing to talk to anybody. Try to be as pleasant as I can, right?
Sure.
and I've done a lot of campaigns for others. I haven't done much for myself, so I've got a lot to learn. But to me, it's just showing up and trying to talk to and listen to as many people as you can, and trying, obviously sell to them that what you're trying to do would really benefit their lives and their families' lives, right? And also say that, again, I try to play the experience, because I do believe my experience, in government, having first been a janitor in Old Town City Hall and ended up running a state agency is a pretty broad, and both in a challenged big city in the state of Maine and the state government in Maryland, and then overseas for the federal government. I think it's a fairly broad range of experience, which I think is good. I mean, I really
experience goes a long way. I certainly agree that.
And I think it's important, because I think it's given me a better understanding of government, as well as not just government, but governments in other countries and places in conflict. Immigration, for instance, I worked in Haiti for 19 months. We went in as the civil governance component of the U.S. military intervention in '94. And the intent there was to mitigate immigration, quite frankly, by trying to redevelop Haiti that had been destitute and been driven into the ground by a military junta, plus an economic embargo. So I've been a range of issues, I think, that are relevant today that I've had sort of on the ground experience. So I try to convey that to people if they've got questions about, certain issues or experience.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say, I admire you for running on a large scale campaign, because I'm doing a smaller one. It's not easy.
Mike, before you leave, Mike.
Yes. Hi.
You want to give us a quick rundown, David, if you don't mind, because he's going to has to leave. Can you give us a rundown on how you're doing with your campaign?
Oh, I think the